Okay, so we're going to continue rigging the code cane. So we're going to start adding the controller and its attribute. Okay, so let's unhide everything and put everything back to its default state. So make sure all is set to 0 in terms of vector and curvature. Now we're gonna go to NURBS, okay, and click circle. Now I want to make this circle a bit bigger, right? And then I'm going to press all these buttons. Remember, whenever you want to rig a certain object, there are procedures that you have to follow. Okay, so click all these, right? So everything is 0, 0, 0, and the scale is 1, and the history is all gone. Okay, so let's rename this as controller so you don't get confused. Now, we know that there's going to be a bending and there's going to be a squash attached to this controller. Okay, so select all this controller and you go to edit and then add attribute. Okay, now I want to switch to Photoshop. Okay, so we have to add these 2 extra attribute. Okay, squash, and there is 3 value, -10, 0, and 10. Same thing with the bending. There is -10, 0, and 10. Okay, going back here. Okay, so let's add squash, and let's leave this as it is, and you look at this section. Okay, so it's asking you what's the minimum value and what's the maximum value for this squash attribute. Okay, so we know that we're going to have -10, right? And we're going to have +10, and the default value is 0. Okay, so you have 3 states, and just click add. Okay, and same thing with the bend. So we're going to add new attribute called bend. The negative or the minimum value is -10, and the maximum is 10, and default is 0. Okay, and click add. Now you notice that 2 extra attribute is being added to this controller. Okay, and there is this 2 attribute over there. Okay, as compared to the normal object, it doesn't have attribute. Only the controller have the attribute. Okay, so if you successfully added the attribute, it should be there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to parent all these objects, meaning that whenever I move this controller, all the object will follow accordingly. Okay, so let's turn off the snapping. Okay, and select all these objects. Okay, and use middle mouse button to click and drag inside this controller. Okay, so again, if you successfully parent the object, you should have the same structure. Okay, the same hierarchy structure. Okay, now right now the attribute, it doesn't do anything. Okay, because we haven't linked the deformer and the attribute. Okay, so to do that, you have to use this function called setDrivenKey. Okay, and you can find that setDrivenKey under animation. Okay, so let's switch this Dropbox to animation and go to key, setDrivenKey, and then set. Okay, so this is when the confusing portion comes in, basically. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to Photoshop. Now, you notice that there is 3 states. Okay, there is this state 0, and there is a negative state, and there is the positive state. Okay, so there are 3 0, meaning that you have to set that condition 3 times. Okay, now if you look at this window, okay, there is a driver and there is a driven. Okay, so driver mean the attributes that control this whole rigging or this squash in particular. Okay, whereas driven is the attribute that is being driven by this driver attribute. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing, so I think it's better if you do the practical portion. Okay, so as for the driver, right, it's going to be the controller. Okay, so a controller is going to be the boss basically, and driven mean is the slave. Now, let's select this controller, right, and click load driver. Okay, so it will load all these attributes along with this new one that we just added. Okay, so in this case, we'll be looking at squash. Okay, so let's click squash. Alright, it's going to be the boss. And what about the driven or the slave? Okay, so let's look at squash handle 1. Okay, and if you look at this input, right, the one that actually control this cylinder to be deformed is actually squash 1 and factor. Okay, whenever we put some value in a factor, things are changing. Okay, so it's not actually squash handle, because if you try to click this as slave or driven, right, you cannot find factor. Okay, so do be careful, and you have to select the correct handler or the correct input. Okay, so to do that, you have to click squash handle and then squash 1 and then load driven. Okay, now there are two things are being loaded, so just click squash 1 and to automatically load the necessary attributes. Okay, now here's the thing. So we know that the one that control the deformation is factor. So let's click this, right? And again, we have to click 3 times member because we have 3 states: 0, minus, and positive. Okay, so when controller is being set to 0, nothing will happen. Okay, so let's click this for the first time. Okay, now next is when the squash is set to 10, it will be elongated upward or stretch upward. Okay, so let's put this 10 under squash attribute. Okay, and you go to squash handle 1 and click this squash 1, and maybe I'm gonna put this value of 1. Okay, so when squash is set to 10, this is what should happen to your cylinder. Okay, so once you're happy, you press key. Okay, now to test this, right, let's go back to the controller and put this value of 0. So when I put 0, it should go back to normal, right? Okay, everything seems working fine. And if I put some value, right, value of 10, it should be stretched upward. Okay, it seems fine, so everything works accordingly. Now we haven't adjusted the negative value right here, right? When it's negative, it should be squash. So let's do this one last time. So make sure the driver is correct. It's the controller, squash, and let's look at the driver, or in the driven, slave, squash 1, factor. Okay, now make sure this is set to minus 10. So when squash is minus 10, I want this to be squash like that. Okay, when you're happy, right, with the behavior, then you click key. Okay, now let's test. Let's close and test it again. Okay, so when this set to 0, it's like that, and I set this to minus 10, it will be squash. Okay, so it seems everything works in order. So I'm gonna use a slider. So I'm click this attribute and I use Control and the middle mouse button. Okay, so it will do one more testing. Okay, so everything seems to be fine. for squash. Let's put this back to 0, and we're going to do the same thing with the bending. Okay, again, select the controller, right? Then you go to key, set driven key, and a set. Okay, for the driver, select the controller, right? Then for the driven or slave, select the bend. Okay, and then click this bend one, and then load driven. Now again, we have 3 states, so we have 0, -10, and then 10. So you have to set the key 3 times as well. Okay, so click this bend one, and curvature and bend is set to 0. Okay, press key. Okay, so I want to set this bend to be positive, so let's put 10. Okay, and go to bend 1, and curvature. So when this is set to 10, it will bend to the right, and press key. Okay, go back to the controller. When this is set to -10, it will go back to, or go bending to the other side. Press 90 and press key. Okay, so let's test it out. 0, 10, -10. Okay, one more time. Okay, so everything seems to be working in order. Okay, and you can also combine the value for the squash and the bending like that. So this is when bend with the value of 3.3 and with the value of 6.2 for the squash deformer. Okay, and if I move, everything also move accordingly. Okay, so that's how you do rigging for the Coke can. And when you finish, you can save the file as Coke rigging. Okay, MA, MB doesn't matter, and then you can submit this as your milestone.